The reality is when we're united, and we are, when we're united and we speak with one voice and we talk about look, nobody knows policing more than the rank and file officers that do it every single day. I mean, they truly have their finger on the pulse of every community. So when it comes to, we went through a period of time where we were excluded from all of these discussions, and we had academics and politicians that were making decisions that we knew were going to cause problems. So it was a time for us to step up, push back in the media. Two areas. When you look at the halls of power, it gave us the opportunity to push back on the anti-police narratives and provide facts that in the importance of the role that we play in society. And at the same time, we also held media accountable. When they attacked law enforcement officers, we pushed the narrative more towards factual information.
We're excited today to have the National Fraternal Order of Police President, Patrick Yoes, join us on the podcast. President Yoes, welcome.
And thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I was just down with you guys at your biennial conference a few short weeks ago. So first, I should say congratulations. You and the entire executive board were reelected for another 2-year term. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. What a great conference too. 6,000 of my closest friends over for a week in South Florida. What could go wrong? But a very positive, high energy conference. Got a lot accomplished, and just very exciting about the future of the FOP.
I couldn't agree more. And when I was there, and you graciously allowed me to make a few remarks. I may bring up something I said there here on this podcast, but you look out, and as you said, 6,000 of your closest friends are out in the audience, and it was just high energy, and it was energizing leaving there. And speaking of that, before we sort of jump into all of this, as I was at the conference and as I work with the FOP over the past several years, one thing that strikes me is union membership, labor union membership across the board has just plummeted in this nation. And if we put up a chart, you would see it just crashes down. But for the FOP, that is not the case. You guys are adding members, and I think you're up to 382,000 FOP members. Help me understand that.
If you go back and you look at our numbers, you'll see I think we're a little bit different than other unions. We're very specific. We only represent police officers, period. Just as a public safety area. If you look back historically, our numbers, although they flattened out at times, we never lost membership. There were times when maybe a little leaner than others, but I think if you look back and the changes that we've had in our country in the last 6 years alone, with COVID and all of the unrest and the police reform movement and just attacks on law enforcement, all of that put together, it gave us an opportunity to really push back on the entire narrative of anti-police narrative. It allowed us to really excel as an organization and voice the frustrations of our members, rank and file officers across the country. And because of that, I think it put us in a unique position where we actually saw in the past 6 years alone, at a time when people were leaving law enforcement at pretty high numbers because of the instability that was created, we actually saw a 32,000 member increase over 6 years from that number, which brings us to 382,000, our largest and oldest rank and file officer organization in the country.
That's incredible. So since 2019, you've added 32,000 members to your roles. And again, during a period, and I think that helps explain, as you were saying, part of it, from 2020, COVID, and then George Floyd hits and everything else that goes along with that. Police officers are looking to an organization that could represent them and advocate on their behalf and advocate on behalf of the profession.
The reality is when we're united, and we are, when we're united and we speak with one voice and we talk about look, nobody knows policing more than the rank and file officers that do it every single day. I mean, they truly have their finger on the pulse of every community. So when it comes to, we went through a period of time where we were excluded from all of these discussions, and we had academics and politicians that were making decisions that we knew were going to cause problems. So it was a time for us to step up, push back in the media. Two areas. When you look at the halls of power, it gave us the opportunity to push back on the anti-police narratives and provide facts that in the importance of the role that we play in society. And at the same time, we also held media accountable when they attacked law enforcement officers. We pushed the narrative more towards factual information. Do we get it right all the time? No, no, we don't. As a profession, when anytime there's there's a great deal of uncertainty in what we do. Anytime you have escalation in lack of compliance, it's always uncertain, and bad things are going to happen. That's the reality of it. Our job is to examine each one of those, find ways to improve the criminal justice system and policing in America, and that's what our role is. Like, there's not a single officer that took this job to do anything other to improve the life of the people they serve within their community. So, when we all work together, when everybody's on the same page, that's when things happen. And when Fraternal Order Police is a perfect example. Right now, we're pushing back on these narratives. We're voicing the frustrations of our members in the halls of power, whether it be in Washington or in city councils and state legislatures across the country. And what that's doing is pushing us to in the forefront of representation. You just simply look at the media mentions. When we track all of that data, and we know that we outpace every single organization, national organization out there, not even close. So obviously, what we have is working. When we're united and we speak in one voice, we make a difference. And I think that's why you're seeing the growth in our organization, while maybe others might not be experiencing the same.
Yeah, and before we jump in, I just have it's almost like a myth buster question here. I was actually going to save it for the end, but just sort of flows into this part of the conversation, because one thing that has driven me crazy is you would often hear, some would say, not naming who would say that, but some would say, they hear police union there, or they hear unions, and they hear that they're trying to block progress, or they're trying to block something. Now, again, my experience, that is not the case, and obviously, being very close to the national FOP over the past several years, like, you guys are anything but that. But I'm sure you hear the same thing. And you have any response to those who think police unions simply exist to jam up the works?
Absolutely, it's not the first time. It's not the first time that this has been thrown at us. Obviously, I just put it in this context. We're a nation of laws. We're a nation of processes and certain stability issues that exist as public as any employee. We provide that sort of. Police officers are no different. It's somewhat at times a very volatile profession, and there are expectations that there is some representation for people who, in any profession. The fact that we're law enforcement officers is no different. So my position has always been that we have a right way and wrong way to do things, and our responsibility is to represent our members. And when we get it right, we need to fight for them, and when we get it wrong, we need to figure out how to improve and move forward. So I think that is a perception that is created by people who would rather cloud up the narrative and not necessarily recognize that the way that they treat public employees, especially police officers, is proper. We would not advocate taking away the rights of criminals or anyone who's charged with a crime and anything else. But as a police officer, somehow we want to hold them as a different set of standards. Everyone has a right to due process, and we defend that right to due process with the ultimate goal of making our community safer.
Well said. Now, I think the format of this podcast. So, though we started with a bit of a conversation here, we pull a couple of headlines from the past week, which people can find in my weekly briefing Substack for those who subscribe. And then, you are a dedicated public safety professional. You've dedicated your life to this profession. You spent 36 years in active law enforcement in the St. Charles Sheriff's Office, which is outside, not too far outside of New Orleans. So you're someone that I respect greatly in your opinion and your views and your perspective on things. So I'll get the headline and a few facts, and I'll just let you respond to these articles and sort of some things that are happening right now out in this country, affecting police officers and communities. All right, headline number one is from USA Today. Does the U.S. have a crime crisis? Why crime always seems to be going up? That's the headline. FBI data shows crime has fallen for decades, but Americans aren't convinced. Gallup polls since the 1990s consistently find people believe crime is rising. And recent fights in Washington, D.C. explain why. Even the D.C. Police Union has accused city officials of inflating the drop in crime. raising questions about the numbers, the statistics. So the truth is, I think we all know crime data is messy. Well, maybe we don't all know, but crime data is messy. Not all 18,000 police agencies report their data to the FBI, and major crimes like domestic violence and hate crimes and others are often missed or underreported. And in social media amplifying violence and deep partisan divides, it's no wonder people are skeptical about crime data and pushing a narrative that crime is down. And it's not just the FBI data, there are other sources that would push the narrative that crime has dropped precipitously. We covered this in our first podcast with Chief Kevin Davis. In his jurisdiction, Fairfax County, they, just like many jurisdictions, have seen a drop in crime. But people are skeptical, and probably what's happening in DC lately made people more skeptical that perhaps the numbers don't always match up. So, President Yoes, how do you respond and how do you react to that?
Well, Mike, there's a lot that you've said in just that one section. We could probably spend the next couple of hours talking about this. I will say this, but in lies the problem with numbers. The reality is numbers are impersonal. They don't care whether you like them or not. And when you look at them, it's really hard. It's easy to make them so impersonal that we don't realize we're talking about real lives. So I think if you really want to look at it, the public and my officers will tell you the truth is not found it isn't found in spreadsheets. It's found in where we live, our own experiences, whether someone we know or ourselves have been touched by crime, and you add to that a nonstop cycle of news and social media coverage that it makes legitimate fears. So you talked about DC. So let's dive into that. And I want to, I'm not picking on DC because we can duplicate this in cities across the country, but DC is the one that's in the headline right now. So let's talk about that. You look at the murder rate, for the fourth nationally. In 2023, they recorded 265 homicides. In 2024, that number dropped to 186. Let me ask you, is that something to celebrate? On paper, that's progress. That's, we look at those numbers and say, okay, maybe we're doing something good there. But here's my question. When hundreds of people are still being murdered in the streets, is that really something to celebrate? The perception is in fact reality. For our members and officers on the ground, the claim that crime is down is not universally embraced. I think there's immense pressure to show progress, and because of that, it interferes with the true picture. So yes, we need to measure data. We need to look at all of these factors to determine whether or not what we're doing is effective and whether we need to make changes. But the reality is, in Washington D.C., there were 186 people last year that were killed in. That's shattered families that are forever changed. As an organization, as a profession, we have to do better. And when you take the politics out of it, and we really must take the politics out of it. You need to look at the numbers of being impersonal. Let's recognize this: that every cop knows that when you take violent offenders off the street and hold them accountable, crime goes down. And every cop also knows that when you ignore even minor crimes, what you do is erode the rule of law. And when you do that, you blur the lines, and it's very confusing for people to follow. Washington, D.C. has been handled a gift, as far as I'm concerned, with resources that will help deter crime. They should take it. All you have to do, I've watched across the country where state legislatures, at the request of cities, have asked the state legislature to either send in National Guard or, to augment some of their police presence, or state police assigned to high crime areas or tourist areas. And they make a good argument why it's necessary to do that. City leaders really push hard for it to happen. But now that we have this going on in Washington, D.C., the whole argument is we need to have local control. Well, look, the reality is at the end of the day, we're talking about real lives here. And anytime someone is going to offer help in order to be able to combat crime within a city, then we should be asking ourselves, how can we make this better and how can we use these resources? And that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're allowing politics to make these decisions for us. And at the end of the day, we need to recognize that what we're doing is we're harming people. Because at the end of all this, that 186 families is a perfect example. While we might be having progress, we cannot be satisfied with what we're seeing. So, in terms of the president's takeover of Washington, D.C., there's three things that I'd like to see. One, we could talk about policing all we want. We could build jails as quick as we could build them. I promise you, we're a very efficient profession. We will fill them for you. At the end of the day, really what it comes down to is we have to have the entire system working together. So you can blame police for crime. But in reality, it is much greater than that. It's the court system, it's the judges, it's everything. And until we have all of that, we're not going to get it. We're not going to make headway. So we have to have a holistic approach on how we're going to fix this. It's not just a policing issue. It's much greater than that. The second one is we need to empower the officers we need to provide some stability for those that are on the job. In late 2023 or the latter part of 2022, the city council took steps in Washington, D.C. that eroded the stability for our officers that work the streets every single day. They created an unstable environment, and what it ended up causing was people to leave for more stable areas because of the actions that they took. If we need to protect the Metropolitan Police Department officers. If we protect them, then they're going to protect us, and there's no question about it. They would not be there if they weren't dedicated and want to make a difference. But what has been done to them is wrong. They need to provide stability. They're putting their lives on the line. They're trying to do a job, and we need to show them the same respect. So we need to roll back those disastrous changes that they made. And then the last one is a big one we have to have. It's got to be part of this discussion. That's fine. We can bring all the resources in. And DC is a perfect place to do it. They have all of these federal agencies that are located there that can add extra resources. But you got to ask yourself the question: what happens when they all go home and they leave the DC Metropolitan Police to police the city? There has to be a long-term, sustainable approach to how we're going to get past this. Crime isn't about numbers; it's about people, it's about communities, and the truth is, in a rule of law. And until we recognize all of that and put politics aside, we're just not going to accomplish. We're not going to fix the problem.
Yeah, I think you make obviously a number of great points. One, there are families, there are faces, there are families behind those who have been victimized, and there's always progress that needs to be made because these are real lives and real people. So any help to try to continue to reduce victimization is a good thing. And I think people who watch this podcast or read my Substack know that my mentor was George Kelling. He's the co-author of Broken Windows, so I am very well versed and also a proponent of taking care of the small things because we know the research. We know the research in terms of what drives people's perceptions of crime, what drives their fear. And as you mentioned, it's disorder. It is the small things, the physical and social disorder. And you and I both spent a considerable amount of time in DC. So you could say that crime is down and murders are down, which is true. But when people, everyday citizens, whether you live and work in the city or you come in to visit, if you see signs of disorder, then you're questioning whether the crime is really being driven down. And I think we are seeing that across the country as well, where the numbers, murder tends to be a pretty reliable statistic because you have a body and it's easier to, it's not so easy to undercount or misreport a murder. But still, if you have signs of physical and social disorder, like you're going to see people questioning these stats. And last thing, I know politics plays a role, but I did see yesterday or a couple of days ago, Department of Justice has opened an investigation into how the DC Metro Police are gathering their statistics and reporting it. So I believe there was a captain that was put on administrative leave not too long ago, and I know the president of the local lodge and has questioned those stats. So it will be interesting in the days and weeks to come to see what comes of that investigation as well. And I hope, like you, politics doesn't play a role. I hope it just helps uncover or helps make things better, whether that's gathering more reliable statistics or bringing more help in to make DC safer.
Yeah, no doubt. Look, Greg Pemberton is the chairman of the Labor Committee and president of the lodge, the FOP lodge that represents Metropolitan Police Officers. He's doing an amazing job representing his members and really articulating the challenges that exist as the rank and file police officers. We tend to get lost in this whole equation as politicians make decisions, but it's really the boots on the ground, the ones that are doing the job every single day, the ones that have the relationships in the communities. They're the ones that have the most reliable information on the pulse of what's happening in the city, not the politicians.
Yep. All right, moving on. This next one's not actually an article. There's a bunch of articles I sort of pulled together. But first, I'll point out that the National FOP does an incredible job collecting data on officers who are shot and killed. Like there's no other database that does that. It's not a federal database. It's not kept by some university. The National FOP keeps this data, and they publish it monthly, which is just a tremendous, well, one, drawing attention to what's happening, but also a tremendous resource. So just call this next section, which we've seen, you're very familiar with, that we know ambush shootings are up sharply. And I actually have flipped what I was going to say because you're 100% right. Uh, we could talk about the data, but there are names behind what's
Right.
happening. And just in the past few weeks, just a number of tragedies from Utah, which happened very recently, where two officers were killed answering a domestic disturbance call. A deputy and a K9 were also
Correct.
injured. They were shot in that incident. Lorain, Ohio, we all remember that was only a few short weeks ago, where an officer was killed and two colleagues were wounded eating their lunch. They went to a quiet place to eat lunch and they were ambushed. And the suspect had additional guns and explosives in his car. In Thompson Township, PA, two Pennsylvania state troopers were struck by rifle fire as they were responding to a welfare check, going to check on someone, going to try to provide help to see if things were okay. And they were shot at and struck by rifle fire. And in Gibson City, Illinois, an officer and deputy were wounded, were wounded, just responding to a report of a naked man walking down the street. Again, I put in parentheses when I say these routine calls, but these are not calls that most people would think are, would lead to these dangerous outcomes. But, they were responding to a naked man walking down the street and they're shot, they're ambushed. And then in Atlanta, Georgia, and this one actually didn't get a whole lot of news, two MARTA, that's their transit system in
Right.
Georgia. Two transit officers were shot without warning, investigating a minor complaint. So you guys push out data, and that's just in the past probably 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And we know from the reports that you push out that the good news is the number of U.S. law enforcement officers shot and killed has declined from the record highs. Doesn't make it better, but it is trending in the right direction from the record highs. But the one category, and you've spoken out about this and been very passionate, the one category of violence that continues to rise and is alarming are these ambush attacks. And I think your data show that there have been 45 ambush-style attacks just in the first 7 months of the year, where 56 officers have been shot. So we're on pace to blow past last year's number. So I'd love just to get your perspective on what's going on.
So I'll start with something that you said. There is some encouragement, and that's the fact that we don't have as many officers that are being fatally shot. But that doesn't mean they're not trying to kill us, and that's what the data shows. The data shows that the numbers are off the charts. Let me give you an example. Well, let me back up and tell you how we started collecting this data, and then I'll kind of dive into it a little. Back around 2019, we could see the trends. We know that they're happening. There was never any effort put into tracking the amount of officers that were shot in the line of duty, and then adding to that ambush style attacks. That data was not kept by any federal agency. So in 2015, we started doing it just with simple Google searches, and it gave us some pretty alarming numbers. So with that, we continued to push and continued to do it. And we went on about 5 years, kind of growing our ability to be able to track this data through available sources. And then eventually we're able to get a federal grant in order to track this data. So when you look at the shot and kill data, that is generated by the Fraternal Order Police for the Department of Justice, and that's what they create their yearly reports on. So we're very proud to do that because I think what it does is it calls attention to something that we could see the trends happening. But it's almost like we numb to the fact that police officers are expected to have this level of exposure, and that's something I really want to dive into. Let me give you an example, and let's just look at the last 2 years. Now, you gave the numbers already for 2025. We know that it's on track to at the very least be the same that it's been for 2023. In 2024. But let me just combine those 2 years. There were 720 officers that were shot in the line of duty in 2023, 2024. That's 720 law enforcement officers. Show me another profession other than the military that is exposed to that type of violence. 96 of those were killed over those 2 years. Now here's the alarming, just as equally alarming, is 179 ambush style attacks. Congress knows the facts. They see the headlines, they read the data, and yet they do nothing. So this is where it really is frustrating on our part. This is what we're using as data to try and create a national education, but a national movement in order to recognize that something has to be done. And we are in my opinion, we have an epidemic with empirical data to show that there is a problem in America, yet we're ignoring it. I mean, let me draw a contrast, and this is no disrespect to any other profession, but if there was a coal mine collapse somewhere in the United States, Congress within days would hold hearings to talk about workplace safety and the need to be able to address so that when people go to work, they have an expectation that there's a certain amount of safety being put into their exposure. Uh, Law enforcement officers are different. They should be doing that for coal mines, but here we are in empirical data, and we can show you for, what, 15 years now, uh, data that shows that attacks on law enforcement are out of hand. I mean, they really are. There's no questioning about it. Yet Congress is not recognizing that. We need Congress to recognize that they need to pass the Protect and Serve Act. When somebody attacks a law enforcement officer within a community, and especially an ambush, what chances do you think that they have, that person, the respect they have for their own community itself? So if they're going to do this to a law enforcement officer, they'll do it to anyone. And so if you really want to address crime, attacking law enforcement officers is part of that equation, because they are the criminals. They are the ones that are the most violent, and something needs to be done. So we need Congress we need them to step up and pass the Protect and Serve Act. If someone is going to single out a law enforcement officer and attack them for violence, just like other classes of individuals in the United States, we need to understand what it truly means. And it's a stain on society, and it's an attack on a community. And we need to allow federal charges, the possibility of federal charges, not necessarily federalize it, because there's still the avenues or in state and local jurisdictions to take action. But at the same time, we need the federal government to recognize that they need to make it very clear that attacks on law enforcement officers are are not going to happen. And if there are a number of different avenues for them to address it. So when we end up in cities where we have progressive prosecutors who don't put much credit, much emphasis on holding people accountable for violence of law enforcement officers, it would give the federal government the ability to come in and take those charges as well. America's law enforcement officers deserve respect and action, not empty promises. There's empirical data to show that something needs to be done here. And until we recognize the elephant in the room, and that is that it truly exists, we're not going to make our jobs safer.
And the Protect and Serve Act, that would allow prosecutors, federal prosecutors, the ability to bring federal charges against those who commit violent acts against police officers?
Correct. It doesn't mandate it, but it gives that avenue that otherwise doesn't exist. There are a number of things that trigger. Yes, they still can bring federal charges, but there's a number of different avenues that have to trigger. And the problem is that I think that a lot of the argument is they don't want to give more power to the federal government, but in reality, what you're doing is giving power to those that refuse to hold people accountable within communities. So there needs to be some checks and balances. There's a perfect check and balance. If a local prosecutor is not going to hold people accountable, then the federal government can come in and do so.
Yeah, and like you said, if you guys are not collecting this data, we would be. I don't want to use the word celebrating, because still officers are dying in the line of duty. They are being shot and killed. But we would be looking at the trend of those fatally shot, going down, and thinking things are getting better, perhaps, or
Well,
the streets are
I
safer.
think, yeah, I think you could add three things to this. One, I would argue that law enforcement officers today have never been more trained and better prepared than they are today. That's a fact. We are a much more professional organization than we were 10, 15 years ago, and my expectation is we'll be that much better 10, 15 years from now. So let's put that one aside. I think that if you want to look at the reason why we have a reduction in the amount of officers that are being killed, I think we can put them in technology. We can put them in ballistic technology. We can put it in technology that's available to protect the officers. We can put it in training that trains officers how to create to protect themselves should they be shot. All of these I think are key factors that are important, and also consider advances in medicine as well that are able to save officers. I think those three things are really the key factor of why we see less officers because the numbers don't show that there's less being shot.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to sort of make that point. If you didn't collect the data, you wouldn't see this alarming
Yeah,
trend, which is the rise in these surprise attacks, which is
right.
the most dangerous threat facing law enforcement. Yeah, I mean, on the technology side, we had Chief Brian Rippey of the Texas Department of Public Safety on a few episodes ago, and they have outfitted their entire fleet with ballistic windshields and ballistic doors.
Yeah,
And the number, I mean, and that's as the chief was telling us, that took the governor and that took the legislature in Texas, like to be committed to doing this to help prevent officers from being shot and killed, and it has done that. But that was an investment, and he was advocating that others should look, other elected officials, if you want to make a difference, like right there, has helped save lives within Texas DPS. And I was, not too long ago, was a shooting in Philadelphia, and the bravery of those officers who
yeah,
scooped up their wounded colleague. And you hear it with the radio traffic. If you listen to the radio traffic, it would bring you to tears.
yeah,
It was an ambush attack. They scoop up their colleague as bullets are being fired, and they rush him straight to the emergency room. They didn't wait on the ambulance. If they had not taken that action, he probably would have bled
yeah.
out and died. But so you are seeing training kick in. You're seeing certainly better technology with ballistic vests. You're seeing a bigger push to make sure officers are actually that they do wear their vest. But there's still, as you said, a lot of work to be done.
It's an interesting. I had this just as a tidbit of information because it's not just this training is not just helping law enforcement officers. It's also helping the community as well. And there's a perfect example of the I guess the battle medicine that's being taught to law enforcement now. The ability to be able to recognize the things that they need to do in order to stabilize life. There was an incident that happened years ago in Indianapolis. Indianapolis FOP. Well, in Indianapolis where an officer was shot. There was one of the officers that was on scene who was just got out of the military and had field medical training, and immediately grabbed his bag and saved the officer's life. And the officer exists today. He still today has a son. His life is forever changed. But at the end of the day, what he saved his life. The FOP partnered with a number of groups and gave out these medical trauma kits to every officer. And to this day, there are hundreds of not only officers saved, but also people within the community that they've used these kits on in order to be able to save. So, yes, our whole mindset has changed. Technology's changed. There are a whole lot of factors that are allowing us to survive some of these attacks. But as I started this section, that doesn't mean they're not trying to kill us at levels that are really alarming, because they are not letting up at all.
Well said. Now, you mentioned the Protect and Serve Act. That's one of your legislative priorities. What are a couple others as we start to wrap up here that the National FOP is pushing that we should know about?
There's no shortage of movement. Obviously, Protect and Serve is moved up. We just finished the Social Security Fairness Act, which was a huge win for public employees. Something, and I'm very proud of the role that we played in helping it pass. But success has 1,000 fall. There's a lot of people were involved in that, and it really was a disservice to public employees. I'm glad we finally got it fixed. Bad things happen quickly, and they generally are not bipartisan. Good things, anything positive and meaningful that has been to policing, has a bipartisan approach. So that was one thing when Social Security Fairness Act were able to do, is take the politics out of it. And when you think about it, we had the outgoing president, we had the seated president, the incoming president, we had the Speaker of the House, the minority Speaker of the House, we had the leader of the Senate, and a whole host of people were co-sponsors on a bill that helped push it through. Well, yeah, that's what happens when we work together. We can fix real problems and fix an injustice that happened for 40 years. So another story for another podcast, maybe. Obviously, Protect and Serve is where we move it there. We also recognize that there's a problem and discrepancy with lack of equity when some of our federal law enforcement officers in their classifications when they were hired, essentially doing the same job but have a different level of benefits, things that is very difficult because it's such a smaller group to try and get to a national cohesive approach around it. But nonetheless, one that we are taking, because what we're watching is people who protect some of our most sensitive infrastructure in the United States are have such a drastic turnover is simply because of the classification they had. Working right next to me, we have more benefits than others. Something that needs to be fixed so we can provide stability and have some longevity that people that have some of our most critical infrastructures. There are a number of other
Sure.
issues, obviously technology issues and how they affect the policing profession. Something that is going to be evolution, right? We're
Mhm.
constantly seeing how technology is impacting what we're doing. So there's a number of areas that have to do with our ability to be able to police, give us greater tools in order to be able to protect for major events. So all of these are factors that we're very much ingrained in discussions and trying to come up with some reasonable tools for us to be able to address technology. The problem with technology is that it is always going to change faster than our laws are. So it
Yep.
always puts us at a disadvantage because criminals have ability to this technology, and we're always playing catch up. So we need to be much more aggressive in our approach in keeping our laws consistent with the technology as it changes. And then one of them that they feel very passionate about. You look at what a law enforcement officer is exposed to. I mean, look, here's the reality: law enforcement officers deal with a segment of population that most people think don't exist, and in fact, they are. And their repetitive exposure to invisible trauma, it takes its toll on law enforcement officers. You often I hear people say it's a shame. He was such a good officer, but look how he's turning out. Uh, Never once considering that the actions that person is doing for their community is actually causing these problems, this invisible trauma that exists and causing this disruption. Look, I've always said, and I strongly believe that when something's broken in the service of others, we have a moral and fiduciary responsibility to fix that what's been broken in the service of a community, rather than cast them aside, saying that there are problems. We need to recognize the damage we did to them. We need to build that resilience in the very beginning in academies. Any legislation, and we've been very active in pushing officer wellness and recognizing that we need to have greater sustainability for law enforcement officers. We're doing a great deal of investment in officers with training in there. The reality is when you take someone into law enforcement, you're looking at 5-6 year journey before you have an effective officer. So what we're seeing is people that are leaving our profession because we've not given them the tools that they need in order to be resilient. So officer wellness is certainly something that we're very much focused on as one of our top priorities, and the list goes on. I mean, we
Yeah,
can
yeah, yeah,
go
for
for a
sure. And
while.
if you want to see the legislative priorities of the national FOP, you can
Right,
go to their website, and
absolutely.
there's a list there, and it certainly tells you how you can get involved, like how you can
Yep.
support the
And we
protective service.
also, look, Mike, one thing we definitely, one thing that we constantly very much engage in. Look, this is a national trend. There's no, I don't, there are some agencies that may be somewhat immune to it, but I'll give you my explanation of why I think they are. The reality is that we're struggling to maintain at a level we need to keep a staffing level of best and brightest in law enforcement. So when we have a recruiting and retention problem in America, I will argue that we don't have a recruiting and retention problem. We have a retention and recruiting problem. Because when you take care of the officers that are there now, they are your greatest recruiters. We need to invest in making sure that we give law enforcement officers all the tools they need to be able to succeed. And if we do, I think the others will follow. But when it comes to recruiting and retention, we need to recognize that our next wave of law enforcement, the ones that are going to help define the future of law enforcement, they're out there, and we need to make sure that we get the best and brightest. At the same time, we need to recognize that maybe changing some of our standards in hiring may be something worth discussing. A good example might be education. There are a number of agencies that require college, and look, I get that. I understand. We want people that are going to make the best judgment calls as they can, and education is a factor to that. But I'll also argue that maybe that might be an area where we could say, okay, we will lack somewhat of the college, but at the same time create a pathway for them to be able to get that while they're on the job as well. So I think we need to rethink the way that we're doing. One thing that we need to make sure that we do not do, absolutely full stop, we don't need to lower standards when it comes to moral character of individuals. We're asking people to do some pretty profound work. And in order to be able to do that, we need to make sure that we have the right We can teach education. What we can't do is teach the difference between right and wrong of people who don't understand it. So when it comes to lowering standards, there are some agencies that are toying with that idea. I can tell you, if you look back in the 70s, you'll see that experiment has been done, and there are a number of case law to show that we need people that can make sound decisions, and we need to focus on bringing the right people in, but also recognize that we can also build those future leaders by giving them a pathway to be able to succeed.
Yeah, a number of things there. I mean, I think the number one issue is officer wellness and safety. That we have to take care of the officers who, we had uh, Chief Renee Hall on a couple of episodes ago, who's now the president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Noble, and she said the same thing. Like just the trauma, the direct and indirect trauma that officers go through is unrecognized. And you hear about the worst of the worst, but you don't understand what they see on a day in and day out basis because they are being called to help people sometimes when they're at their worst, and they're being called to do things and to respond to things that you and I, well, you have for sure, but
I,
most people just don't understand that
I,
that they're dealing with.
I tell you what, the best way to describe this is that the weight of the world can make even the strongest knees buckle.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, well said. And on the the education thing, I am glad to see, and I covered this in the weekly briefing about a month ago. There are a number of major agencies that are now re-examining the college education requirement. I was fascinated to read that a lot of it was based on one study, or at least they're still hanging their hat on one study, which is survey based from like 15, 20 years ago. Like the world has changed. A college education is different today than it was 15, 20 years ago. Like we know a lot more about policing than we did. Like I think that it is time to re-examine that, to make sure we do get in those who are the best and the brightest, have high moral standards, and have other life experiences that certainly match or exceed what
Right.
you may get from going to college.
The main thing is develop a pathway for continuously advancing people within an agency. Look, the Fraternal Order Police, we have probably 10, 15 colleges with reduced benefits that allow reduced tuition that allow our members to take advantage of that. There's nothing stopping agencies from doing those same exact partnerships, bringing them into their academy, bringing them into their agencies, and create a pathway where you can get those college educations, but do it through the department itself in partnership with local colleges.
Sure. One final question. I ask everyone this question at the end. Now, for you, we've talked about a lot of priorities: officer safety, wellness, technology, certainly ambush shootings, et cetera. But I'll still ask you the question. It may be something you already said or something that you haven't. But here's the question: what's the one thing on the horizon that you don't think we're paying enough attention to when it comes to public safety?
Well, that's a big question. Let me focus in on one because we covered a lot of ground here, and I think I've hit a few of these things that I normally would have put into this category. But I'll take one of them that I'd like to dive into a little bit more, and that is the use of technology. I think if you look at the evolution of police unions, actually all unions for that matter, there is a lot of concern that technology is going to displace workers. I think law enforcement is a little different in the fact that we already are struggling to get law enforcement officers to come into this profession. So I think technology and the use of technology is both exciting and frightening at the same time. Technology, I think, gives us a path to be much more efficient and effective in what we're doing. Let's just face it, AI is going to allow us, in my opinion, to analyze crime trends to a level that we've never done before because we just don't have the bandwidth to be able to do it individually when it gets as large as it is. I think these are all tools that are going to be helpful in allowing us to be able to not only combat crime but also predict crime as well. Also on the other side of that is some of the technology that could be integrated into things that we're doing, existing platforms that we have. Look, I'll use body cameras as an example. The FOP was one of the first police unions to come out and say, you know what, this is something we need to do. And if we look back on it, what we'll find now is that most officers would not go anywhere without it. I think if you talk to any officer who's been on a job for a little while, he or she will be able to tell you some probably more than one instance where the body cameras actually saved them from false accusations against them. Body cameras are not. I remember when it first came out, everyone was all up in arms. We need to fight this. I think we need to recognize that this is a discussion and an education that we need to have with our agencies and those with the technology and the officers themselves. And if you exclude any of those three into it, then I don't think you have a very cohesive environment to be able to institute technology. But in reality, is if we're going to be effective in doing more with less, then we're going to have to embrace technology. And I think there's an ability to be able to take a number of the platforms that exist now, incorporate some future technology into it that will allow us to be much more effective and efficient. We need to embrace these. Here's the problem we have. I've always said, my members, two things they hate the most is change and status quo. So we're struggling. We struggle like everybody else. I jokingly, although I don't not quite that bad, but I jokingly say that my VCR still flashes 12 o'clock, which suggests that I have a VCR and I don't know how to change the clock. I think we don't like change, but in the end, we're going to change or we're not going to be successful.
Right.
We're not going to be effective. Really change. Our technology and collaboration are going to be two things that are going to bring us to the next level.
Yeah, and I will give you the last word, but I will say the one thing I said in front of your 6,000 friends at your biennial conference a few weeks ago, something now I'm becoming a lot more attuned to and passionate about. That you hit the nail on the head in terms of technology, not just in terms of making officers more efficient, more effective, helping keep communities safe, help keeping officers safe, all that goes along with that. But even recruitment and retention. I mean, the newer officers want the latest, greatest technology that they have in their personal lives. But I am convinced that the same forces that were all about defund the police several years ago, they have now repositioned themselves and they are targeting technology. And let me be clear, there are concerns that always must be looked at when it comes to privacy and civil liberties and the controls you put on technology. And obviously we're giving technology to police, but like those same forces are trying to defund police today by denying them of technology, which is going to put them further behind the curve. So I know you guys are aware of that and on top of it, but it's just something that every time I read new legislation introduced in, say, in California or someplace else, is the same groups who are trying to defund the police originally. Now they just don't say defund the police. They're trying to defund technology budgets.
Well, I'll sum this up what I call the tale of two cities, and we can pick and choose who those cities are. In order to be able to effectively police, in order to be able to have safe communities, good strong schools and property values and all of the things that are associated with strong communities, we have to have a community that's working together. And when everyone's working together, recognizing that all the pieces of this puzzle are an important part of the quality of life that we have, in those cities, they're succeeding. In those cities that they think that one part of that is wrong and they're going to defund policing is a perfect example. What you're seeing is the unrest and the disconnect that exists in some of the major cities across this country. Until we all recognize that we're all in this together, that it is our families living in the same exact communities, and we need to recognize that what we're saying we're doing under social justice is actually hurting the very communities that we say that we're trying to help. We need to sit down and have meaningful discussions with all of the components that create the quality of life within a community and be part of it. It is the tale of two cities. Look at those that are succeeding and those that are not, and ask yourself why not.
President Yoes, thank you for joining me, and thank you for coming into the briefing room.
All right, thank you, and I appreciate all you do as well.
Thank you for joining us today in the briefing room. If you enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll go to policebriefing.com, where you can find all episodes of the briefing room. And also, you can find reference my weekly Substack that goes out to thousands of police leaders and public safety officials. It's delivered to your inbox every Monday morning. If you go to policebriefing.com, you can find that and you can hit subscribe. I hope to see you here next week for another edition of the briefing room.